The odds of generating a simple cell, if such a thing even existed randomly, given the most unrealistically conservative circumstance with only 215 proteins, we've never even seen anything this simple, averaging only 150 amino acids in length are, here's the number, guys, 1, it's staggering, in 10 to the 41,000. And you don't have a cell membrane. 1 in 10 to the 41,000.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the It Stands Written podcast. My name is Braden. I have Gavin in front of me. We are in part 3 on the topic titled Not a Chance in our series on creation versus evolution. Last episode, Gavin, you took us more into DNA and how it performs and functions and how it was made and how these organisms are able to read code, produce code, write code, and just the relationship that DNA has with proteins and how proteins need DNA to be created. DNA needs proteins to be recreated, and just this cycle that it creates. So that's kind of where we left off. You're going to take us into this part 3 as we conclude this topic.
Yeah, thank you again, guys, for letting me do this. And we refer to that as integrated complexity when we talk about the conforming patterns that both the DNA has with the the translation process all the way through. And so today we're going to take this a step farther and start talking about what we call pattern recognition and chance elimination. It goes into a little bit of mathematics and statistics. And Braden, if there's something that's not clear here to you, it means that nobody else understood what I said either. That's my fault. Stop me and I'll go back over it. So in statistical hypothesis testing, they set up something known as a rejection region, okay? And what they're trying to do is catch or identify events that result from factors other than chance, okay? So if we're talking about coin flips, for example, we would expect if we flipped it 100 times to get roughly the same amount of heads as we would tails. A rejection region would be if you had a dramatic deviation from what was expected, and say you got heads 100 times in a row, you go, well, that's way off, right?
Right.
And so these rejection regions basically say, you might want to have a look at that coin and make sure that it doesn't have a side that is, say magnetic and causing it to fall on the table a certain way, or heavier on one side or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so when something like that happens, what it sort of elucidates is that there is a law-like necessity, okay? That's one option. The other thing is it could be design. Someone could be cheating, right? So, which of the two it is, you'd have to sort out differently. But the point is, you can clearly say that chance has been eliminated. That's not one of the options. Mm-hmm. If we were to flip a coin 100 times, let's go back to the math from the first episode in this series. We talked about when we started Not a Chance, and we know that the number of outcomes are 2. If we did it 100 times, the way we'd calculate the different combinatorial sequencing would be 2 to the power of 100, which is to say that there is 1 times 10 to the 30. That's a log number. That's 10 followed by 30 zeros to tell you how many different possible outcomes there are in that event. Okay. So we would say that an event with 1 in 10 to the 30 is a very improbable event, but improbability doesn't mean that something other than chance was responsible. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is going to sound contradictory, and we're going to think about it, but I'm going to kind of walk you through here with William Dembski's help. Highly improbable events don't happen by chance. Just about everything that happens is highly improbable. Both claims are correct as far as they go. William Dembski. Okay, so let's unpack this. I'm going to take, for example, there's a book sitting next to us here on the table. It's The Mortification of Sin by John Owen. And it's an abridged version, and it is still, let's see, how many pages here? Over 100 pages long. Okay. The words that are in here are highly improbable. They cannot be compressed. Okay. Yet, things that are just as improbable as this happen all the time. Okay. Mm-hmm. We used, for example, throwing a handful of sand out and watching it scatter, right? A bunch of marbles, how they might roll around and where they would finally stop and which side was up and down, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
The very fibers on the soft materials in the room that we're sitting next to are in an arrangement that they weren't in yesterday. Last time you just moved one of these over, everything changed. Mm-hmm. So highly improbable events don't happen by chance. The example in the book, just about everything that happens is highly improbable. Both claims are correct as far as they go. Now, there's a missing link here. When I give it to you in a minute, it's going to go, okay, that's the difference. This is the distinction that we need to make to make sense of it. So we refer to this as what's called the improbability paradox. Two equally improbable events seem as though they should be explained in different ways. Here's an example. winning roulette 100 times in a row is equal to the probability of 100 games of roulette, any 100 games. Therefore, chance can't be rejected by probability alone. Okay, so what I'm saying here is, if I say, what are the odds of winning 100 games of roulette in a row? And I think it's like 38 to the 100 or something, right? I think there's that many pockets, okay? You say that is a very improbable event. But if I said, well, hey, what are the odds of, any games, not just the winning ones, but any games of roulette 100 in a row? The answer is still 38 to the 100, right? So to reject chance, mere improbability of an event or a sequence of outcomes, whatever it is we're measuring here, isn't sufficient. There has to also be, here it is, a significant pattern within that event, okay, or a significant sequence, right? So it wasn't improbability alone that justified the elimination of chance. It was the match between one event and a pattern we recognize from another. This would be something we use in plagiarism detection, just for kind of a real world example. If you look at two guys' tests and see that one of them is conforming, word for word very close to another, you can say, okay, even though we told them to write about the same subject, the odds of them coming to this exact conclusion, while there were so many different ways it could have been done, say it's an open-ended question, make us conclude that something other than chance was at play. Odds of them just guessing the same words in sequence are pretty low. Right. What it does is recognizing that pattern helps us to reject chance as an explanation. So, for example, we might compare the winning bets that we can make on roulette to the statistical norms, right? So statistically, it's not normal to win 100 games in a row. And we're looking at specifically the ones that they win. So a statistician must deem a certain kind of event or outcome as significant. And let me just add to that, before it occurs. Which you might think that's redundant because I said they're deeming an outcome, meaning, in other words, in advance of the event, they're saying, here's what we would expect. We set up our rejection regions. We figure it's 1 in 38 odds to land in this particular pocket, right? And so here's what we'd expect to find. Dembski had this realization that a significant kind of event is a synonym. It is identical, is the same thing as a pattern, a significant kind of event. So let's just say that during the testing of a roulette table, the same pocket receives the ball 100 times in a row. You might say, okay, a pattern is emerging here. It's pretty evident, okay? It suggests a physical defect, and on inspection, a high edge is discovered, right? So we've basically ruled out chance in favor of necessity. So there are 3 modes of explaining an event. It can happen by chance, it can happen by necessity or a law-like process, or it can happen by design, agency. Someone says, from a mind, a rational conscious being saying, hey, here's where I want this thing to go. Here's where I want to place it, whether it's every letter in a book, the ball on a roulette table, whatever the case is. Those are the only 3 ways we can explain these things. Now, what's interesting here is this. Dembski points out that it's not necessary to anticipate or pre-specify a pattern for, or a rejection region, because you can actually recognize many patterns after the fact. An example would be decrypting a code. I'm going to give you another one. I'm just going to tailor an example he once gave to try to make it a little more modern. Let's just say that you observe a birthday party happening, okay? And it's a family, it's dad's birthday, and the kids, he's got a bunch of kids. They all say, all right, Dad, you ready to open gifts? He says, sure. The first kid gives him this huge box. He opens it up, and it's a set of golf clubs. The second one gives him another huge box, and it's a golf club carrier. What do you call it? Right?
Golf bag.
Golf bag,
Yeah.
Thanks. You can tell I don't golf.
Yeah.
The next one says, here you go, Daddy. Opens it up. It's a Travis Matthew shirt. Okay. And the next one, it's a set of keys. He walks over in the garage and finds out there's a golf cart in there. Okay. And they went all out. Now, what we recognize from this is there was probably a pattern that they pre-specified.
Right.
We didn't. They did. But we can look back and go, what are the odds that all the things they gave him pertain to him being able to go out and golf? Probably without discussing it. Pretty slim. His lucky day that all the kids just randomly guessed this. He doesn't even ask them, oh, wow, you guys you really thought this through. Like you talked about it. No, he doesn't. Yeah. He doesn't even need to. He goes, wow, guys, this was really thoughtful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. That there was a pattern after the fact. If you and I were walking along, let's say, this is an example that's kind of interesting. Sometimes our background information is the only thing that limits us from recognizing the pattern. So let's say you and I are walking along a hiking trail and there's just rocks scattered all about. Okay. And at some point you stop me and go, hey man, check that out. And I look down and I see rocks like everywhere else we've stepped for the last 100 miles. And you say, isn't that cool? I say, what are you talking about? And you say, the constellation pattern oh, I missed that. I'm not into this kind of thing. I don't really know. And you say, yeah, someone actually arranged these in a certain way. You can see that they actually used a larger rock to be, Betelgeuse on the corner of Orion, and this one here is smaller. And you start to say they actually used rocks of various sizes to make them look like the, relative to what the size would have been on the star.
Right.
And see, the thing is, I could have walked by that and missed it. But you didn't because you were familiar with the pattern that I wasn't. The point is, you're still looking after the fact and saying, yeah, it's pretty clear. Let's say there's 20 rocks at play here. And the odds of being, it's almost like someone used a ruler or something to keep it at scale. Pretty evident someone did this. And I go, oh, okay, interesting. I would have walked right by it. Mm-hmm. So nonetheless, they can be recognized after the fact.
Right.
So Dembski basically came to this conclusion. He said statisticians identify patterns before performing experiments. Cryptanalysis must discover patterns after the fact. They're both looking at the same event. Now, this is complicated. I'm sorry, it's going to get a little bit worse. Now, we just talked about how improbability alone wouldn't be sufficient to reject chance. You would also need it to match with a pattern. But let me just go a step further and say a pattern alone wouldn't be sufficient to reject chance. You also need small probability. So a pattern alone, let me give you an example, like getting heads 3 times in a row or getting 30 on roulette twice. Neither of those events are improbable enough to eliminate chance. So now the question becomes, okay, where do we draw that line? When is an event improbable enough to eliminate chance?
Right.
Okay, so for chance elimination, a pattern is necessary but not sufficient, right? A quantitative judgment of improbability is also involved. How improbable does it have to be? Okay, the starting point here to do this equation is 0.5 or 1/2 or 50-50, right? The odds of something occurring being greater than half or less than half is turning point to decide whether something is more likely to happen or less likely to happen. And all we're ever going to do is see how far from this median we can get, right? How likely does something occur? So for example, in civil court, when we're talking about money only, a preponderance of evidence is sufficient to close a case. Say, look, we're 51% certain that this guy's case is correct. He wins. That's not sufficient when it comes to criminal, okay? Because the stakes are higher. You got people actually spending time in jail or getting a penalty worse. And so just to say there's a preponderance of evidence is not enough. It has to be guilt beyond reasonable doubt, which means we got to get to the far corners of these rejection regions because if we made a mistake, it could be fatal, literally, right? And so the question is how far you can deviate in either direction, which means that ultimately this will boil down to a matter of faith in the end. If you want to be the atheist who says, I still think these things evolved. Okay, well, we're going to find out shortly. I'm going to put some real numbers on this today that you're going to have to go, yeah, this took a lot more faith than I once realized. Okay. Right. And by the way, guys, if that's where you stand, it's okay to turn around. This is the time. Okay. So we want to know, it depends basically on the improbability of the event in question and how many opportunities there are to generate the event. Okay. How many times were there that this event could have come about? We refer to these opportunities for the event to happen as probabilistic resources. Now let's pretend that there's a huge audience right now, okay? 500 people in an auditorium, okay? And I'm up there teaching this subject, and I say to everybody, look, I'm trying to make the case here that, events of very, very small probability just don't happen by chance. Specified ones to be particular. So just to prove the point, I have a combination lock here, and there's 30 digits on the lock, and it requires a match of 3 of them in a particular sequence to get the thing to open. So here's what I'm going to offer to you guys. I'm going to say to anybody in the room who's willing to, I need a volunteer basically, right, to prove me wrong, because I'm going to make a point strong here today that specified events of small probability do not occur by chance. And so here's the thing. If you're able to open the lock, during this class, I'm going to give you $100. If you're not, you're going to give me $1. Okay. So I'm making the odds very low. Anybody want to take me up on this? A few hands go up. I randomly choose a guy in the 3rd row. He walks down, takes it, goes back to his seat, and he's supposed to play with that during class while I continue to talk. So I start to say what I have next, and halfway through the sentence, he yells out, "Got it." And he unlocks it and he holds it up, and everyone kind of gasps and goes, "Wait, what?" I go, "Hold on, let me see it. I think he cheated." Mm-hmm. He comes down. I look at the lock. Sure enough, it's unlocked. I say, what were the numbers? He said it was 26, 4, 32. Excuse me. I said 30 numbers. He couldn't have said 32. Okay, so I just made a mistake there. He says 26, 4, 11, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I go, yeah, that's the sequence. Now, the whole class there's a pause, and they start looking at each other going, wait a second. How did he get that? That's 1 in 27,000 odds. It took him 1 minute to figure it out. Did he cheat? Yeah. You guys, everyone in the room just found out there's a pattern there. And what was it? He already knew the number. I set this up. I didn't choose him at random. I lied to you when I said that. I lied to the whole classroom. Mm. The guy that I pointed to was a plant. He knew in advance. And now you guys all get the point that I was trying to make, which is that small events, specified events rather of small probability do not occur by chance. That's known as the LSP, or the law of small probability, something that William Dembski is the author of. Okay. Right. Now, when you take a phrase like specified events of small probability do not occur by chance, you go, well, how small is the probability? This is an elliptical phrase. Let's say, Braden, you were to ask me, hey, what was the score last night between the Buccaneers and the Cowboys? And I say the Buccaneers, I think they got 20 points, and Cowboys 5. And you say, 5 what? 5 points. You wouldn't ask me what I meant. It's an elliptical phrase. In other words, it refers back to the prior one. So when someone says, well, how small is small enough? How small probability is he referring to when he says specified events of small probability did not occur by chance? He's saying small enough. That's what he's meaning. It's supposed to be an elliptical phrase built into the meaning of it. And if you want to unpack it, that's where we're headed. Okay. So the point is we can detect these things, even when someone's lying to us sometimes, and go, yeah, no, this is clearly plagiarism. These guys had a plan before he walked up there and did this demo. Okay. So evolutionists obviously like to talk about time being the hero of the plot, right? And if there's enough time, then all these nonsensical ideas they have are just bound to come true. There's a guy named George Wald, and in 1954, he made this stupid comment. He said, time is the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible, probable, and the probable, virtually certain. Okay, so everything's just bound to happen if you give it enough time. This is the case they make.
Yeah.
So when we're asking the question, where did the information in DNA or some equivalent information-bearing molecule come from? Or we're asking, how could proteins have arisen directly without DNA or an equivalent source? These guys that say, look, I don't know, but given enough time, it's going to happen, dude. Okay. By the end of this, you're going to be trying not to laugh at these people and do the polite thing and talk them back off their cliff. Okay. Mm-hmm. So no one disputes the fact that books contain large amounts of specified information. Okay. Accordingly, no one argues that they result from chance. We look at a book, we look at a software program, we go, yeah, someone was behind that, clearly. Why? Why do we come to that conclusion? Well, chance can produce some specified information, but it's very limited, right? It's hard to produce even a long word if you're stirring alphabet soup with time constraints. Okay, usually you're going to get a couple letters at most to line up. They might even be facing the wrong direction, but if you stir all day, you might get up to 3 letters. The point is you'll keep stirring and finding out this isn't going very well. I need about 1 million, billion, zillion more years. Okay. Right. So origin of life researchers started to reject the idea that specified genetic information arose by chance alone. But of course, they don't want to give credit to God. They don't want to talk about agency, so they've got to come up with something else. And so they realized and they recognized that the problem wasn't simply generating this improbable sequence of bases. The problem was relying on random search or shuffling to generate one of the rare arrangements, the very specific ones, and where these molecules also perform a biological function. And cells require a vast amount, a huge amount of specified information to operate. So having, this arise by chance was, I'm going to word exactly how Stephen Meyer did. He said it was a vanishingly small likelihood. So they were on the cusp of throwing all the chance hypotheses in the trash. And they said, okay, we've got to move on to something different. Mm-hmm. But before we do it, we want to try just one more thing. So in the 90s, they started performing experiments, searching to find what the minimal complexity might be. Because what they're talking about these cells, they say, well, these are current modern cells. They didn't always used to be like this. They were much, much more simple back in the day. This arose over a very long period of time. Mm-hmm. They say, so, we're just going to ignore the evidence in front of us and assume that it must have been much more simple back in the day. Okay. So they start the minimal complexity experiments. And the attempt here was to reduce cellular function to its simplest form. A lot of this was just theoretical. So if you take Mycoplasma genitalium, which is a very small, in fact, it's the most simple known cell. This is one I mentioned once before. It lives in the human urinary tract. Okay, this is the, quote, simplest cell. And remember, this is what we've been talking about this entire episode. We've only been talking about the simplest one known. Mm-hmm. This simplest one has 562,000 bases of DNA. It requires 482 proteins to operate, which means you have approximately 1,200 base pairs per gene. Okay. Yeah. Each of those having a 1 in 4 odds of occurring. And so what's happened is biologists have made increasingly informed estimates of the minimum number of proteins and genes that a, quote, hypothetical protocell might have needed to survive. And so these are unproven theories, but it would suggest that it's possible, barely, that they could exist on 250 to 400. We've never seen it, but they're saying, could you just strip away some things and it would still boot and still work? Even if it didn't work as well, could it still work? Is there a way? Mm-hmm. Even so, DNA alone isn't the only thing that's needed to solve the problem, right? You would still need, even in that simplest form, a huge suite of pre-existing proteins, right, to operate this code. And RNA and molecules and polymerases and, transfer RNAs and rRNAs and synthetases and ribosomal proteins to process the DNA. And on top of that, there's a whole bunch more I'll explain in a moment. So a, quote, simple, nonsensical bacterial translation requires over 100 specific proteins. Okay. It's not simple. In addition, you need an energy production and a processing system that turns ADP into ATP. That process alone, just to make the thing drive, that process requires a 10 enzyme glycolysis pathway. Okay. So step after step after step after step after 10 times to get that thing, just to push the energy to rotate this thing through. Without that, it wouldn't matter if you had the code. And that's not the end. You still have to have a cell wall, and it must be semi-permeable. If it's not, nothing's going to happen. Okay. You need phosphates. You need lipids, right? You need sugars. You need vitamins. You need metals. You need proteins. You need enzymes to catalyze this process, or it won't go quick enough for it to actually run. All of that has to be present in a simple cell. Okay. In a theoretically simple cell, because of course there is no such thing as a simple cell. You'd need nucleic acids, and that's still not the end. So calculating the minimum complexity of DNA without explaining all the other parts, it vastly underestimates the task at hand. It's not even close to solving the problem. Even if they use these things, it's still ridiculous and they know it. So they start going, okay, hold on. This DNA thing's out of control. Maybe there's another way. So maybe instead of a DNA first model, perhaps it was a protein first model and it coded backwards the other way and became DNA some other way. Well, they're going to look into this because they just love wasting their own time, but it should be roughly the same odds. Okay. So they're saying we're talking genetics here, the actual DNA versus the gene expression, meaning the protein. Which one came first? Maybe we go backwards, and here's what we look at. The problem is the same. All these neodarwinists face the sort of combinatorial problem, meaning that the number of ways a set of objects can be arranged, right? That's what we refer to as combinatorics. And for every combination or base, amino acid sequence that function, a huge amount do not, right? So if you take, a sequence space in a book of 6 letters, right? There are zillions of arrangements you can put into that, right? A lot. We can calculate the number if we care to. The point is, only a couple of them do something functional. And of all the different ways we can arrange our nucleotide bases, of all the different ways we could do the same with our amino acids, only a couple of those arrangements actually have function. So the longer the sequence, the bigger the problem, because the odds of getting functional proteins diminish exponentially. Right? The more that's at play, the harder this becomes. Now, when we talk about amino acid combinatorics, we know that there are 20 amino acids that we use to create our proteins, but there aren't 20 amino acids out there. There's about 500. Only 20 of them are used in biology, right? So if they were all at play, the problem would be bigger. It's almost like you have to isolate in advance, like you were actually doing this on purpose, creating something. You'd have to isolate the 20 of those 500. We'll ignore that. So if I have 20 amino acids to choose from, and I want to string just 2 of them together in a particular order, that would be 20 to the second power. There are 400 ways I could arrange them. If it's 3, we go from 400 arrangements to 8,000, just like that. If it's 4, we go from 8,000 to 160,000, just like that. Now, in biology, this is observable. A short protein has about 150 amino acids minimum. So if we went from 400 to 8,000 to 160,000 possible sequences and just going 2, 3, 4, remember, we have to get to 150 to make a realistic short protein. So here's how we calculate this. The different ways they can be combined to create the smallest protein possible in a protein first theory would be 20, ignoring the other 500, to the 150, which is a 10 followed by 195 zeros. Those are the arrangements possible. Okay. And just a handful work. All amino acids form peptide bonds or they will not be able to fold. Okay. So the odds of getting a peptide bond versus a non-peptide are 50-50. It can go one way or the other. So if we're going to do the math on that, we go 1/2. Okay. Odds of peptide versus non-peptide to the 149 is a chance of 1 in 10 to the 45. So even if we had the proper sequence, if they don't all peptide bond, it still doesn't matter. With only one exception, amino acids have distinct mirror images of themselves. We call optical isomers. You have a left-handed form and a right-handed form. Okay. Imagine if letters were reversed when you looked at them, kind of like a dyslexic type kind of thing, right? Or that's not really a good example, but actually mirror image. It won't work properly. Right. Okay. So proteins only tolerate the L form isomers. And L form and D form are produced with roughly equal frequency, which means there's another 1 in 2 chance here to the 149, which means 1 chance in 10 to the 45. So if we look at this and we summarize just the last few minutes here, what we talked about, the amino acid combinatorial sequencing, assuming that we're excluding all but the 20 amino acids used in biology, which is 10 to the 195, the peptide bonding, 10 to the 45, and the left form amino acid is also 10 to the 45, we would add those together. We come up with one chance in 10 to the 285. That's a 10 followed by 285 zeros to get one protein that's useless by itself, okay? That's all left-hand isomers, that's all peptide bonded, that's properly sequenced. That's the odds of getting it.
Yeah.
And with all those odds, remember, it's still alone and it can't do anything. It has nothing else to work with. It would need another protein or another anything that's conforming to its shape that it can work with to manipulate and operate as an actual protein or molecular machine.
Right.
So these chance theorists, they get stumped. And then an idea came to mind. And it wasn't go read Genesis and believe it. They started questioning, how tolerant are proteins to change? What if we made, instead of just the minimal complexity argument, what if we could make small changes to the protein itself and see if it still works, right? So if they could handle these changes, it would increase the odds of random synthesis. And so they used what was called cassette mutagenesis. And in the 1980s, a guy named Robert Sauer did this on about 100 proteins to determine how much variance, within the amino acids could be tolerated at any given site on the protein. And of course, the odds were exceedingly small. It was one chance in 10 to the 63. So let's put these numbers in perspective because they're so large. The Milky Way galaxy, okay, has 10 to the 65 atoms. That's how many are in the Milky Way galaxy. We're way beyond our solar system here.
Yeah.
And he's talking about one chance in 10 to the 63. Okay. Now, from 96 to 2004, a guy named Douglas Axe, and this guy's written some books, he's really a cool guy, tested even further and published his findings in the Journal of Molecular Biochemistry, okay, the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. Since proteins can't function unless folded into stable structures, right? Just being a long strip doesn't do anything. It has to fold into a structure that becomes a molecular machine. Axe was going to measure the frequency of folded sequence space. In other words, only the ones that will actually fold into a proper shape and exclude the rest. This provided a measuring stick for the frequency of functional proteins, any functional protein at all. Given the results, the number of 150 amino acid sequences capable of folding into functionally ready structures, the number of possible sequences of that length is a ratio of 1 in 10 to the 74. So just to get one that will fold, out of all the various things we can do, is 10 to the 74. The odds of finding an atom in our galaxy by searching blindly are about 1 billion times greater than randomly getting a 150 amino acid long functional protein. Just for some perspective, the odds of randomly producing a functional protein are calculated with the current, and this is accurate research, this way. We take peptide bonding, L-form isomers, and the probability of correct sequencing, not just any sequencing like we did further, and now the number is 1 in 10 to the 164. There are 10 to the 80 particles in the observable universe. Okay, so if we back out of the Milky Way, we go to the whole thing, all that we can see, 10 to the 80 particles, that's all you've got to work with. And the odds of getting this to work on one single protein is 1 in 10 to the 164. Odds just aren't there. If you guys want to still believe this, you know you're being dishonest. You've committed, intellectual suicide, and ultimately you're damning yourself for eternity. Okay, not too late to turn around. So the odds here, guys, of generating a functional protein are a trillion times smaller than finding one specified particle in the observable universe. Those are your odds. If you want to play them, you'll go to hell by choice.
Yeah.
I just said trillion 7 times for the record, but who's counting? Remember, those are the odds of a conservative 150 amino acid length protein. RNA polymerase that actually reads the code has 3,000. And some proteins are over 30,000 amino acids long. Each one coming from a code that required 3 nucleotide bases. That's 90,000 correctly sequenced. The odds of generating a simple cell, if such a thing even existed randomly, given the most unrealistically conservative circumstance with only 215 proteins, we've never even seen anything this simple, averaging only 150 amino acids in length are, here's the number, guys, 1, it's staggering, in 10 to the 41,000. And you don't have a cell membrane. 1 in 10 to the 41,000.
Wow.
Okay, we're going to talk a little more about probabilistic resources here, okay? We talked about the number of opportunities an event has to happen. So when we gave the combination lock example, you said, what's surprising about it is even though there were 27,000 different ways he could have tried to open it, he got the right one on the first try, okay? But what if I gave that guy all week to do it, all month? eventually he'd get there and you'd say, we're starting to cross that threshold now where we've gone past the 50% mark. Odds are actually in his favor. He's going to get it because he's tested, say, half of 27,000 possible arrangements. So let's look at the what's known as the universal probability boundary. Okay. This is something William Dembski, I believe, started or authored. It has been manipulated since and made more accurate, but he's talking about how many opportunities are there in the universe for an event to occur. Well, this is actually calculable. And the probabilistic resources for the entire history of the observable universe will be calculated like this. We're going to start with how many particles there are. 10 to the 80. That's a lot of atoms. Okay. And let's pretend that all of them are at play. Every single atom out there is trying to, create a protein out of amino acids. Everyone's at play. Because there's an upper limit on the speed of light, only those parts of the universe that are observable can affect events on Earth. Okay, thus, the observable universe is the only part of the universe with probabilistic resources relevant to explaining events here, right? So if it's beyond the scope of what we can see, what light there is, it can't possibly have any effect on an event happening right here. It's out of the scope, okay? So we're using everything that is known to exist for this equation. There have been, according to the Big Bang, which is totally wrong, 10 to the 16 seconds, right? How many seconds are there? How many seconds have there been? If we had all the time that has ever existed to try to solve this problem, it's 10 to the 16 seconds. We've got 10 to the 80 particles for 10 to the 16 seconds. And we know that's totally wrong. We know that the Big Bang is an unsubstantiated, unscientific, physics-violating, disproven theory. It's not. In fact, we couldn't call it a theory. We should say it's just wrong. It's not even a theory. It's stupid.
Right, yeah.
The Big Bang, like evolution, is not supported by science, popular opinion, or the Bible. Okay, it can be completely thrown out. And I actually redid the math here. 10 to the 11 seconds is a bit closer to reality. I tried to figure out how many there are in 6,000 years, and that's the answer. So if I'm trying to improve their math, that's how I do it. But I don't want to improve their math. I want to use their numbers just to set the record straight that even if we had the amount of time they're claiming we do, it's not even close to enough. So we're going to go back. Due to properties of gravity, matter, and electromagnetic radiation, physicists have determined the limit to the number of physical transitions that can occur from one state to another within a given unit of time. Okay, so we're asking how many possible collisions could there be between atoms? We're accelerating them to light speed, okay? A physical transition from one state to another can't take place faster than light can transverse the smallest physically significant unit of distance, an indivisible quantum of space. We call this Planck length, and its distance is 10 to the negative 36 meters. So imagine starting with a decimal, 36 zeros before you get to the 1.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This is a very, very small distance. Okay. The shortest length of time that this transition can take is a unit of what they call Planck time. So we're saying if we have the smallest significant, meaningful division of distance, and it is that short of a space, how long would it take for a photon at the speed of light to cross its path, to get from one side of it to the other? The answer is it would take 10 to the negative 43 seconds. It's over so fast, it's insane. That's called Planck time, okay? So for scale here, just to kind of bring this into something that might be understandable, a person, let's say he's a meter tall, or he's sitting down, he's about a meter tall. A blood cell is going to be like 10 to the negative 6 meters, okay? An atom, we're down to 10 to the negative 9. Okay, 9 decimals before the 1. 1 decimal 9 places from the 1. Now we get down to the atomic nucleus. We zoom in on that. We're at 10 to the 15. Just keep going and going and going and going. You get down to 10 to the 33, and a little bit smaller than that, you're in Planck scale. That's how small we're talking about. Okay, so light speed is 186,300 miles per second. Okay, and it's interesting because the speed of light remains constant even if it's on a moving platform. So if I have a jet that's parked and it's moving 0 miles per hour or knots, whatever, okay, the speed of light emanating from it is still 186,300 miles per second. If the thing takes off and it's moving at 1,500 miles per hour, the speed of light emanating from it, if it turns a light on or something, is still 186,300 miles per second. Right. So the speed of light is a constant. An event, we're going to describe an event as, physically speaking, something that occurs when an elementary particle does something or interacts with another elementary particle, okay? So particles can interact at a maximum of 10 to the 43 times per second. So again, if we take every atom in the universe, cram them together so that they could touch and make that minimal distance between them so short and increase their speed of collision to the speed of light, they could interact with each other 10 to the 43 times per second. That's how many different events you would have. So the number of particles, 10 to the 80, multiplied by the number of seconds, 10 to the 16 if you believe in an older Earth, It's nonsense. Multiplied by the number of interactions per second, 10 to the 43, you now have the universal probabilistic resources, the maximum number of events that have occurred in history, if in fact they were compressed and forced to contact one another, all of them trying to solve just this one problem for an amino acid for all the time they've ever existed, you get 10 to the 139. That's how many events have occurred in the history of the universe if you believe it's old. 10 to the 139. That's your upper limit. Remember, a simple cell, even a short protein alone, is 10 to the 164. You are so many orders of magnitude higher just to get that thing than you have for the entire probabilistic resources of the entire universe. Give it all the time you want, give it all the particles you want, accelerate them as fast as you want, get them as close together as you want. Mm-hmm. It makes no difference. Yeah. The simplest cell that we made up, 10 to the 41,000. To have a good chance, guys, of chance generating a functional protein, you have to actually sample more than half of those sequences. You have to get beyond the 50-50 mark. Okay, out of 10 to 164 sequences, that's how many you'd have to sample. So if we do the math on that, the odds are still 24 orders of magnitude higher than the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. That's a trillion. If every event in the history of the universe were devoted to producing amino acid combinations in the, quote, prebiotic soup, the number of combinations would represent less than 1 out of a trillion of the number of events needed to have even 50-50 odds of generating a functional protein. So Dembski's calculations are a bit generous, and research MIT guys, they basically said the real number is closer to 10 to the 120, but who's counting? So here's the thing, guys. I'm gonna kind of softly end this here, and I think you all get the point. We could go on and on and on. All this is ever going to do is convince you further that you serve a great God and have no business disobeying him, disagreeing with him, believing that you came from something other than him. He created you just the way that you are, with your problems, without your problems. I don't know. Some people are going to make the case that they weren't designed well. They have diseases that I don't. Doesn't mean you weren't designed. You were designed the way you were designed, period. Right. Your car might have problems. It doesn't mean someone didn't design it. Right. Okay. But God knows what he's doing. Unlike the mechanic who unintentionally caused problems to your cars, God doesn't have, unintended consequences. He knows what he's doing. It includes all the bad things, not just the good. Yeah. I want to end with a couple thoughts. I want to give you guys a quote. I'm going to say this as best I can. This actually came from Stephen Meyer when he was debating Mike Shermer and Don Prothero. And if you watch debates between these guys, you'll find that everyone's being dishonest except for Stephen Meyer. They debate the same thing every time they get together. And as if it's the first time it's ever been said, these guys will start in the beginning because they know they have a new audience in front of them. Mm-hmm. And they got called out. And Stephen Meyer once said to these guys, hey, why is it you do this in every debate? I prove you wrong, and then we show up in the next one. And what do? You start exactly where you started the last time, as if this audience, because they're unfamiliar with what we said, is at the same starting point that we were when we started. We're not there anymore. We're way past it. He said this to the guys. If you have a section of digital code or alphabetic text and you randomly change it blindly, are you more likely to degrade the meaning and function that is there or enhance it? Clearly, you're overwhelmingly more likely to degrade it. And one of the reasons for that is it turns out that the ratio of the number of sequences of alphabetic characters that perform functions are meaningful at all to the number of sequences that don't is very small. In a 10-letter sequence in the English language, there is one functional sequence for every 10 to the 14th or 100 trillion non-functioning sequences. So inevitably, you start to degrade things. You're going to move the sequence from function to non-function. It's just what's going to happen. Scientists at MIT started to realize that the digital code in DNA behave the same way, in that the ratio of functional to non-functional sequences is very small. Douglas Axe, we talked about earlier, asked, how rare or common are the functional sequences of genes or proteins in relation to all the possible ways there are of arranging the base characters in the genetic message or the amino acids in the proteins? Mutation turns out to search indefinitely for a functional sequence. Like a needle in a haystack, DNA codes for the order of proteins. Body plans, listen carefully, guys, need a new kind of information still. Body plans refers to where your arms and head are relative to each other, where your feet are, what direction your chest is to your back. Okay, those are known as body plans. So we said DNA codes for the order of proteins. Body plans need a new kind of information still. DNA arranges proteins into cell types arranged into tissues arranged into organs arranged into body plans. The body plan's morphogenesis depends upon information not encoded in DNA, which means you can mutate DNA indefinitely, 80 million years, or till the cows come home, and it just doesn't matter, because in the best case, You're just going to find new proteins somewhere out there in that vast combinatorial sequence space. You will not, by mutating DNA alone, you're never going to generate a higher order of structure that are necessary to building a body plan. Darwinism is grossly inadequate to explain the origin of info to build new genes and proteins, as well as the origin of novel biological form. End quote. Guys, the plans for how you're shaped don't exist in the DNA. We don't even know where they are. Your DNA makes proteins, an operating system sequence, and that's it. We don't know why we're shaped the way that we are. It might have something to do with the cellular membrane, the direction that things split apart from each other. It might be encoded somehow. There's information in there. We just can't find it. It's not in the DNA. It's not in the microtubules. So when someone says, well, when DNA, and they talk like they're sophisticated, they try to confuse you and use big words you never heard. They say, well, when DNA is, going through a mutation or something like that, it's going to produce, a different arm, a different this, different characteristics. You can tell them you just don't know what you're talking about. DNA doesn't code for any of that.
Yeah.
Going back to the law of small probability just for a second, guys, and I promise we'll wrap this up. The law of small probability says that specified events of small probability do not occur by chance. This is useful. This is used all over the place, okay? In intellectual property protection, it's common. I'll give you an example. Encyclopedia Britannica, going back in the day, a huge volume of books. An encyclopedia was written, and they don't want someone to come along and take all the hard work that they put in and make a minor change to the verbiage and then reproduce and sell the entire volume when they didn't put the effort in to produce this thing in the first place. Mm-hmm. And if they can just make, say, a 10% deviation, they might not be accused of plagiarism. The problem is it would still be illegal. And what Encyclopedia Britannica could do is they could set up something called a patent trap. And using the law of small probability, which says specified events of small probability do not occur by chance, they're going to take that information and they're going to secretly put a passage in their volume somewhere about a guy named Braden Zook. Okay. And this guy is an abstract artist. And here's a picture of the work that he did. He was born in, 1924. Okay. And he lived for 30 years and he died of a heart attack. And they start putting all this information about a guy who never existed. Okay. If they turn to somebody else's volume of encyclopedias and find an entry about that same character who they just made up, they can now prove through the law of small probability that they were copied. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they can take that right to the court and say, hey guys, this was a false entry. We made it up. We just put it in there so that we could prove, because it was a specified event of small probability, that it did not occur by chance. We can rule out chance. We can rule out necessity. All we're left with is design. So pay up. And they will. Now, there are other occasions where it's not so easy, but they found a way around it too. And I'm going to use an example, naming some names, but please don't think this is actually something that happened. I'm not trying to accuse a company of being dishonest, but I want to just take Texas Instruments, calculator company, Casio, does a bunch of stuff similar. And you've got calculator software where easily one company could rip the code off of another. All the time it took to produce that, rip it, put it on their calculator and sell it. Mm. And you can't just look at this and go, well, hold on, how do I prove that they ripped my software? 1 + 1 is always 2. These guys could have done the hard work themselves, and they always would have come to the same conclusion because numbers just don't lie. What they do is cleverly, they make an error in their software on purpose. Mm-hmm. You hit logarithm 10, whatever the thing is, 0.35, whatever. And at the end of it, it spits out a number that's inaccurate by 1 digit at the 8th decimal place. So when the guy from Texas Instruments, pulls a Casio off the shelf and pushes that exact number and gets an error 1 digit at the 8th decimal place, he can prove you guys stole our software, mm-hmm. right? The law of small probability says specified events of small probability do not occur by chance. So when we're talking about, preponderance of evidence, we've gone now way beyond it. This is guilt beyond reasonable doubt. You can use these things for that. We also use this not just in patent trapping, intellectual property. We use it for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. These guys who think there's an alien out there are listening for particular patterns and they're filtering them, whatever they hear through radio, telescopes, they're filtering them through this exact sequence. Okay, is it small probability? Is it specified? Is it whatever? And they start to try to figure out whether or not it came from agency. If you take your DNA code and subject it to the same scrutiny, it screams agency. And they're okay with Dembski's work up to that point. They'll use it for their search for aliens. They'll use it for, protecting a book they wrote. But the moment you say, hey, what about this event over here? They go, no, there has to be a better explanation. Why? Because they don't want to be judged. I'm going to suggest to you guys, if you have a chance, there's a animation on YouTube. Look this up. It's DNA animation 2002 to 2014 by Drew Barry and someone else whose name I'm going to destroy, spelled ETSUKO, new word, UNO. Look this up sometime. It's 7 minutes long. really kind of a high resolution example of what's going on in the cell, so you can see some of the stuff that we've talked about and understand and appreciate the complexity of all that's going on. The YouTube channel that posted it is WEHI Movies, all smashed together, one word. Check it out, watch that, understand just how complex these things really are.
And I'll put that YouTube video link in the description so you can just click on it right there.
Perfect. Guys, I'm going to leave you with this. Psalm 111:2. Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. I hope you guys will take some time to look into this for yourself, see that it's true. I hope that people won't use big words to try to trip you up and make you think that they have a understanding that you just don't, and that's why you're not seeing it their way. God's thoughts are higher than ours. His ways are higher than ours. But man to man, no such thing. Just if you guys are ever put in the position to doubt what God has done by someone who's got the right verbiage to confuse you, blow them off and keep going. Okay? They're going to be sorry one day. You won't. So anyway, thanks guys for listening.
Yeah, Gavin, thank you. And yeah, it takes faith to believe in the things that you talked about, because it is something that has no chance and has not been seen. So atheists, they have faith, it's just in the wrong thing. And we pray that they would come to true faith and know that there is a God who didn't let everything happen by chance, but created you for a purpose for him. So listeners, we thank you for joining us on this episode of the It Stands Written podcast, and Lord willing, we will see you on the next one.